My boyfriend got a restraining order against me after I confronted his ex at our apartment. Then I found out who really invited her over that night. The sheriff's deputy handed me the restraining order through my car window at 7:23 on a Thursday morning while I was parked outside my office building. The document said Ryan had filed it 2 days ago, claiming I'd violently assaulted his ex-girlfriend Vanessa in our apartment and that he feared for his safety. I read the words 3 times before they registered. 72 hours earlier, I'd walked into our living room at 11:30 at night and found Vanessa standing there, drunk and yelling at Ryan about money he supposedly owed her. I'd pushed her toward the door and told her to leave. She'd swung at me first, caught me in the jaw, and I'd shoved her hard enough that she'd stumbled backward into our coffee table. She'd left cursing and threatening to call the cops. Ryan had been upset, saying he was sorry, that he didn't know why she'd shown up. I'd called 911 to report the incident, and the responding officers had taken statements from both of us before leaving. Now, 48 hours later, I was being ordered to stay 500 feet away from my own apartment and my boyfriend of 2 years. The deputy, a woman in her 50s with gray temples and tired eyes, told me I had 30 minutes to collect essential belongings before I had to leave. Ryan was inside with the victim advocate, she explained. I asked what I was supposed to have done wrong, and the deputy said the order claimed I'd been the aggressor, that Vanessa had been invited to the apartment by Ryan, and that I'd attacked her without provocation while intoxicated. I'd been living with Ryan for 14 months when this happened, sharing a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex near downtown Phoenix. We'd met through mutual friends at a barbecue 3 years ago, and he'd been everything I thought I wanted. Ryan was 29 to my 32, worked as a pharmaceutical sales rep, and had this way of making me feel like I was the most important person in any room. He was attractive in an effortless way, with sandy blonde hair and blue eyes and a smile that made strangers trust him immediately. I worked as a project manager for a construction company, steady hours and good pay, and we'd built what I thought was a stable life together. We'd talked about getting engaged, about buying a house, about the future in concrete terms that made it feel real. His ex-girlfriend Vanessa had been a shadow in the background of our relationship, someone he'd dated for 3 years before me and who apparently couldn't accept that it was over. He'd told me she'd been manipulative and unstable during their relationship, that he'd finally gotten the courage to leave her, and that she still called occasionally trying to convince him to give her another chance. I'd seen her number show up on his phone a few times, always late at night, and he'd always declined the calls and apologized for the disruption. He'd made it seem like she was a nuisance he couldn't quite shake, and I'd believed him because I had no reason not to. The first red flag I should have caught was 3 months before the incident, when I'd come home early from work and found Ryan on the phone in our bedroom with the door closed. He'd ended the call quickly when I knocked, and when I'd asked who he'd been talking to, he'd said it was his brother dealing with family drama. But his voice had been different when he'd been speaking on the phone, softer and more careful, like he was handling something fragile. I'd let it go because questioning your boyfriend about phone calls felt possessive and wrong, the kind of behavior Vanessa had apparently exhibited. The second red flag was about 6 weeks before the incident, when I'd noticed a charge on our shared credit card for a hotel room in Scottsdale. We'd opened the card together to build credit and had agreed to use it only for shared expenses. When I'd asked Ryan about the charge, he'd said he'd booked it for a work conference and his company would reimburse him. The explanation had made sense at the time, and I'd forgotten about it until much later. The third red flag was 2 weeks before Vanessa showed up at our apartment, when Ryan had suggested I go visit my sister in Tucson for the weekend. He'd said he needed some alone time to decompress from work stress, and I'd gone without questioning it because giving your partner space seemed like the mature thing to do. I'd driven to Tucson on a Friday afternoon and come back Sunday evening to find Ryan in an unusually good mood, talking about how the alone time had helped him feel refreshed and reconnected to himself. I walked into our apartment that Thursday morning with the deputy following me, and Ryan was sitting on the couch with a man I didn't recognize. The victim advocate, I assumed. Both of them watching me like I was dangerous. I asked Ryan what he was doing, why he was lying about what happened with Vanessa. The advocate stepped between us and said I wasn't allowed to speak to Ryan, that any communication had to go through attorneys. I looked past him at my boyfriend and asked if he was serious about this, if he really believed I'd attacked Vanessa without cause. Ryan looked down at his hands and said nothing. His silence felt worse than any accusation. I packed a bag with clothes and work documents while the deputy stood in our bedroom doorway, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip the duffel. When I tried to grab my tablet from the living room, the deputy said my time was up. I walked out carrying one bag and the growing realization that something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. Ryan never looked at me once during the entire 30 minutes. Just kept his eyes fixed on his hands or the floor or anywhere but my face. I drove to my sister Olivia's place in Tempe and spent the rest of the day trying to make sense of what had happened. Olivia had met Ryan multiple times at family events and had always said he seemed genuine and kind. When I explained the restraining order and his claims that I'd attacked Vanessa, Olivia's expression shifted from concern to confusion. Olivia asked if I'd been drinking that night Vanessa showed up, and I told her no, I'd been completely sober. She asked if maybe I'd overreacted somehow, if there was a version of events where my actions could be seen as aggressive. I pulled up the police report from the night of the incident on my phone and showed her the responding officer's notes. The report stated that officers observed no signs of intoxication from me, that Vanessa had visible injuries consistent with a scuffle but no serious harm, that Ryan had stated Vanessa had arrived uninvited and become belligerent, and that I'd acted in defense of myself and my boyfriend. The report recommended no charges be filed. Olivia read through it twice and said this didn't make sense. If the police report supported my version, why would Ryan file a false restraining order 48 hours later? I told her that's what I couldn't figure out, that something must have happened in those 2 days to change his story. Olivia asked if Ryan had seemed strange lately, if there were problems in our relationship I hadn't mentioned. I thought about the past few weeks. Ryan had been quieter than usual, spending more time on his phone, going out with friends more often, but we hadn't been fighting. There were no obvious signs of trouble. We'd had dinner together the night before Vanessa's visit, and talked about our upcoming anniversary trip. Everything had seemed completely normal. Olivia said I needed to hire a lawyer immediately, that restraining orders were serious and could destroy careers and reputations even if they were eventually dismissed. She let me stay in her spare room, and I spent the next 2 hours researching attorneys who specialized in domestic cases. I found a lawyer named Victoria Reeves who could meet with me that afternoon. Her office was downtown in a building with metal detectors and security guards. Victoria was in her late 40s with sharp eyes and an air of having seen every variation of human betrayal. I sat across from her desk and told her everything from the beginning, from meeting Ryan to the night Vanessa showed up to the restraining order. Victoria took detailed notes and asked clarifying questions about specific moments and statements. She wanted to know exactly what Ryan had said during and after the confrontation with Vanessa, whether there were any witnesses, whether I had any documentation beyond the police report. I told her that our downstairs neighbor, Mr. Kim, had called the police that night after hearing the commotion, so there was at least one independent witness to the timeline. Victoria wrote that down and asked about security cameras. Our apartment complex had cameras in the parking lot and at the building entrances, but none in the hallways or inside units. She said we'd need to subpoena that footage before it was deleted on the standard 30-day rotation. The incident had happened 6 days ago, so we had 24 days to secure the evidence. Victoria explained that the restraining order hearing was scheduled for 10 days out, and that we needed to gather as much documentation as possible before then. She outlined a strategy that included getting witness statements from Mr. Kim and any other neighbors, obtaining the security footage, pulling phone records to establish communication patterns between Ryan and Vanessa, and potentially hiring a private investigator to dig into why Ryan would flip his story so dramatically. Victoria asked about Ryan's financial situation, whether he had debts or money problems. I explained that he made decent money in pharmaceutical sales but had mentioned being stretched thin financially a few times. Nothing that seemed desperate or unusual. Victoria asked about insurance, specifically whether we had any policies that covered domestic violence incidents or assault. The question caught me off guard, and I said I had renter's insurance that covered liability, but I'd never thought about it in that context. Victoria said sometimes false accusations were motivated by insurance fraud or civil lawsuit opportunities, that if Vanessa was injured during the incident and Ryan could establish that I was the aggressor, there might be financial incentive to lie. The theory seemed far-fetched, but Victoria said she'd seen stranger motivations in false accusation cases. She quoted me a retainer fee of $5,000 to start, and I paid it with my credit card, feeling my savings account take a serious hit. She said she'd file a motion to contest the restraining order and would begin gathering evidence immediately. I left her office with a slight sense of relief that someone believed me, but also a growing dread about what this process would uncover. That evening, Olivia and I drove to our apartment complex and knocked on Mr. Kim's door. He was an elderly Korean man who'd lived in the building for 20 years and knew everyone. Mr. Kim opened his door cautiously, recognized me, and invited us inside for tea. His apartment smelled like ginger and had family photos covering every surface. I explained the situation carefully, telling him about the restraining order and asking if he'd be willing to provide a statement about what he'd heard and seen the night Vanessa showed up. Mr. Kim's expression darkened as I spoke, and he said he'd been shocked when he'd heard raised voices and breaking glass from my apartment that night. He'd called the police immediately because he was worried someone was getting hurt. He'd seen Vanessa leaving the building afterward, stumbling and cursing, and had seen the police arrive shortly after. He said he'd also noticed something else that night that had struck him as odd. About 30 minutes before the commotion started, he'd been taking out his trash and had seen Vanessa arriving at the building. She hadn't looked surprised or uncertain about where she was going. She'd walked directly to our entrance like she'd been there before and knew exactly which apartment she was visiting. Mr. Kim said that detail had stuck with him because I'd told the police that Vanessa had shown up uninvited, but her body language had suggested otherwise. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Mr. Kim agreed to provide a written statement to Victoria, and Olivia and I thanked him and left. In the car, Olivia said what I was thinking, that if Vanessa had walked in like she knew where she was going, it suggested she'd been invited, or at least expected. I called Victoria from the car and told her about Mr. Kim's observation. Victoria said that was significant evidence, that it contradicted Ryan's claim that Vanessa had shown up unexpectedly. She said she'd get Mr. Kim's statement the next day and would also reach out to the apartment complex management to request security footage immediately. I asked what else I could do to help build the case, and Victoria said I should pull my own phone records showing my communications with Ryan around the time of the incident. She also suggested I try to remember anything unusual about Ryan's behavior in the weeks leading up to Vanessa's arrival, any changes in routine or unexplained absences. That night, I went through my phone meticulously, screenshotting text conversations with Ryan from the past 3 months. Most of it was mundane, coordinating schedules and discussing dinner plans, but there were gaps I hadn't noticed before. Periods where Ryan would go hours without responding to messages during times I knew he wasn't working. I'd attributed it to him being busy or having his phone in another room, but now those gaps felt suspicious. I also noticed that in the 2 days between Vanessa's visit and the restraining order filing, Ryan had sent me only 3 text messages, all brief and impersonal. Going to stay at my brother's for a few days. Need space. I'm okay, just processing everything. My lawyer will be in touch. There had been no calls, no explanations, no indication that he was about to blow up my life with false accusations. Victoria called me 3 days later with news about the security footage. The apartment complex had provided the recordings from the night Vanessa showed up, and Victoria had reviewed them with a forensic video analyst. The footage showed Vanessa arriving at 10:58 p.m., walking confidently to the building entrance and using a key fob to enter. She'd walked directly to the elevator without hesitation. Victoria said the key fob was significant because visitors didn't have access to those, only residents. Vanessa had either been given a fob by Ryan or had somehow obtained one, which suggested premeditation rather than a spontaneous, unwelcome visit. The footage also showed Vanessa leaving the building at 11:43 p.m., stumbling slightly and holding her shoulder. 15 minutes later, police cruisers arrived. Victoria said the timeline matched my version of events perfectly and contradicted any claim that Vanessa had been there peacefully by invitation. She'd also obtained a copy of the 911 call I'd made that night, and the recording showed me calmly reporting that I'd just had to physically remove an intruder from my home. My voice on the recording was steady and clear, with no slurring or signs of intoxication. Victoria said this evidence would be powerful at the hearing, but she wanted to understand more about why Ryan and Vanessa might be working together. She'd hired a private investigator named Lucas Brennan who specialized in fraud cases to look into both of their backgrounds. Lucas called me 2 days later and asked to meet in person. We met at a coffee shop in Scottsdale, and Lucas was a former cop in his 50s who'd gone private after 22 years on the force. He pulled out a folder and said he'd found some interesting connections between Ryan and Vanessa that went beyond their previous relationship. 3 months earlier, Vanessa had filed a workers' compensation claim for a shoulder injury that had supposedly happened on her job as a physical trainer. The claim was pending but hadn't been approved yet. Lucas had obtained medical records through connections, and Vanessa's doctor had noted that the injury pattern was inconsistent with the claimed cause. The doctor suspected the injury might be fabricated or exaggerated, but hadn't reported it because workers' comp fraud was notoriously hard to prove. Lucas said the injury Vanessa sustained when I'd pushed her into the coffee table was to her shoulder, the same area she'd claimed was injured at work. He theorized that Vanessa and Ryan might have set up the confrontation deliberately to create documented evidence of a new injury that could be blamed on me, potentially leading to a lawsuit or insurance claim. I asked if he had any proof they'd planned it together, and Lucas said he'd pulled phone records for both of them going back 6 months. Ryan and Vanessa had been in regular contact the entire time I'd been living with him, with calls and texts happening multiple times per week. The frequency had increased dramatically in the month before Vanessa showed up at our apartment. Lucas showed me printed phone records with highlighted sections marking calls between Ryan's number and Vanessa's. There were calls on dates I remembered clearly, times when Ryan had said he was at work or with friends but had apparently been talking to Vanessa. The charge for the Scottsdale hotel room I'd noticed on our shared credit card? That had been the same weekend Ryan had sent me to visit Olivia in Tucson. Lucas had checked hotel records and found that Vanessa had been registered at the same hotel, same dates. They'd spent the weekend together while I was out of town, using my credit card to fund it. The betrayal hit me in waves, each new piece of evidence layering onto the last until I felt like I couldn't breathe. Lucas asked if I'd noticed any financial irregularities beyond the hotel charge, and I logged into our shared bank account on my phone right there in the coffee shop. I scrolled through transactions from the past 6 months and found multiple cash withdrawals I didn't remember making, totaling about $3,000. The withdrawals had happened on dates when I'd been at work, which meant Ryan had taken the money. Lucas said he'd probably been giving it to Vanessa, funding whatever plan they'd been building. He asked about insurance policies again, specifically whether Ryan was a beneficiary on any of my accounts. I felt my stomach drop as I realized he was listed as the beneficiary on my life insurance policy through work. $250,000 if I died. I called Victoria immediately and told her what Lucas had found. She was quiet for a long moment, then said we needed to meet with the police detective who'd taken the original report from the night Vanessa showed up. She said if there was evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud or potentially something more serious, the police needed to be involved. We scheduled a meeting for the next afternoon with Detective Raymond Ortiz, who'd been assigned to follow up on the initial incident report. Detective Ortiz was in his mid-40s with a reputation for being thorough and hard to fool. He listened to everything without interrupting while Victoria and Lucas presented the evidence they'd gathered. The phone records showing ongoing communication between Ryan and Vanessa, the hotel receipts from the weekend I'd been sent away, the workers' comp claim and suspicious shoulder injury, the life insurance policy, the security footage showing Vanessa arriving with a key fob like she'd been expected. When they finished, Detective Ortiz leaned back in his chair and said he'd had a feeling something was off about the restraining order filing. He'd seen the original incident report and had noted that Ryan's statement to responding officers had supported my version of events. For him to completely flip the story 2 days later had raised red flags in his mind, but he hadn't had grounds to investigate further until now. With the evidence Victoria and Lucas had gathered, he said he had probable cause to look into potential conspiracy and fraud charges against both Ryan and Vanessa. Detective Ortiz said he'd interview Vanessa officially and would also try to talk to Ryan, though he'd likely lawyer up immediately. He asked if I'd be willing to testify about the timeline of events and the evidence of financial irregularities. I said absolutely. I'd testify to whatever helped establish the truth. Ortiz said the restraining order hearing was in 5 days, and he'd prioritize his investigation to have preliminary findings available before then. He couldn't promise anything definitive that fast, but he'd do what he could. I left the police station feeling a strange mixture of vindication and horror. Vindication that people were finally believing my version of events. Horror at realizing that Ryan and Vanessa had apparently been planning something terrible for months, while I'd been completely oblivious. That evening, Olivia asked me what I thought their endgame had been. If they'd successfully gotten the restraining order to stick and established me as the aggressor, what was the next step? I said I'd been thinking about that constantly, and the only scenario that made sense was that they'd been planning to sue me civilly for Vanessa's injuries. With the restraining order and police reports supporting their version, they could claim damages for medical bills, pain and suffering, lost wages. They might have been hoping for a settlement in the 6-figure range. Olivia said that seemed elaborate for what might be a modest payout, and I said unless there was more to it. Unless the life insurance policy wasn't just a detail but was actually the target. I spent the next 2 days going through every conversation I could remember having with Ryan about the future, looking for signs I'd missed. He'd been the one to suggest we get renter's insurance through my company when we'd moved in together, saying it was important to protect our belongings. He'd also been the one to remind me to update my beneficiaries on my work insurance when I'd gotten a raise 6 months ago, saying it was smart financial planning. At the time, I'd thought he was being responsible and thoughtful. Now I wondered if he'd been positioning pieces for something darker. I called Lucas and asked if he could look into whether Vanessa had any history of violence or escalating behavior that might suggest she was capable of something more than fraud. Lucas said he'd check and called back 3 hours later with information that made my blood run cold. Vanessa had been arrested 5 years ago for assault with a deadly weapon after a bar fight that had put another woman in the hospital. The charges had been reduced to simple assault as part of a plea deal, and Vanessa had served 8 months in county jail. Lucas said the victim in that case had suffered serious injuries, broken ribs and a concussion, and had nearly died. Vanessa had a history of violent overreaction, and Lucas said if she and Ryan had been planning something that involved my life insurance, I needed to take that threat seriously. I needed to make sure I was never alone or in vulnerable situations until this was resolved. The restraining order hearing happened on a Monday morning in a courtroom that smelled like floor polish and recycled air. I sat with Victoria at the plaintiff's table while Ryan sat with his attorney across the aisle. I hadn't seen him in person since the day I'd been forced out of our apartment, and he looked different. Thinner, more tense, like he was carrying weight that was crushing him. His attorney was a man in his 50s named Douglas Freeman, who specialized in domestic violence cases and had a reputation for aggressive advocacy. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Honorable Patricia Delgado, who'd been on the bench for 23 years. Victoria presented our case methodically, starting with the police report from the night of the incident that supported my version of events. She called Mr. Kim to testify, and our neighbor described seeing Vanessa arrive confidently with a key fob, hearing the commotion, and calling police out of concern for safety. He testified that I'd always been a quiet, respectful neighbor, and that he'd never witnessed any aggressive behavior from me. Victoria played the security footage showing Vanessa entering the building like she knew where she was going, and played the 911 recording of me calmly reporting the incident. She presented the phone records showing months of secret communication between Ryan and Vanessa, including calls during the time I'd been told to leave town for the weekend. She showed the credit card charge for the hotel where both Ryan and Vanessa had stayed together. The evidence stacked up piece by piece, and I watched Ryan's face grow paler with each new revelation. Douglas Freeman tried to argue that Ryan's relationship with Vanessa was none of the court's business, that what mattered was whether I'd assaulted Vanessa without provocation. He called Ryan to testify, and he took the stand looking like he might be sick. Freeman asked him to describe what had happened the night Vanessa came to the apartment. Ryan's voice shook as he spoke, and he said Vanessa had come by around 2 a.m. to return some belongings he'd left at her place when they'd broken up years ago. He said they'd been talking calmly when I'd come home, that I'd been drinking and had immediately become aggressive. He said I'd attacked Vanessa without asking questions, and that he'd been terrified. Freeman asked why he'd told police a different story that night, and Ryan said I'd been standing right there and he'd been afraid of what I'd do if he contradicted me. The testimony sounded rehearsed and hollow, and several people in the courtroom looked skeptical. Victoria stood for cross-examination and asked Ryan directly why Vanessa would need a key fob to enter the building if she was just dropping off belongings. Ryan hesitated and said he'd given her one temporarily so she could access the building. Victoria asked when he'd given it to her, and Ryan said a few days before. Victoria asked why Ryan would give his ex-girlfriend building access while living with his current girlfriend. Ryan didn't have a good answer. Victoria asked about the phone records showing hundreds of calls and texts with Vanessa over 6 months. Ryan said they'd remained friends. Victoria asked about the hotel weekend. Ryan went silent. Freeman objected repeatedly, claiming the questions were harassing his client, but Judge Delgado overruled most objections and told Ryan to answer. Victoria asked if Ryan had withdrawn $3,000 from my bank account without my knowledge. Ryan said he'd borrowed money for personal expenses. Victoria asked if those personal expenses included supporting Vanessa. Ryan said no. Victoria presented bank records showing the withdrawals corresponded with deposits into Vanessa's account within 24 hours. Ryan claimed he didn't know how that had happened. Victoria asked about Vanessa's workers' compensation claim and her shoulder injury. Ryan said he didn't know about any workers' comp claim. Victoria presented medical records showing the injury Vanessa claimed from the incident matched the exact location of her pending workers' comp claim. She asked if Ryan and Vanessa had planned the confrontation to create documented evidence of a re-injury. Ryan said no, his voice breaking. Victoria asked why Ryan had insisted I update my life insurance beneficiaries 6 months ago. Ryan said it was responsible financial planning. Victoria asked if Ryan and Vanessa had discussed what would happen if I died. Freeman objected loudly, calling the question inflammatory and speculative. Judge Delgado sustained that objection, but looked at Ryan with clear suspicion. Victoria said she had no further questions, and Ryan left the stand looking like he was about to collapse. Victoria called Detective Ortiz to testify, and he explained that his preliminary investigation had uncovered evidence of potential conspiracy between Ryan and Vanessa to commit fraud. He said Vanessa had been interviewed and had initially denied any planning or coordination with Ryan, but when confronted with phone records and financial evidence, she'd changed her story. Vanessa had admitted that she and Ryan had remained in contact after their breakup and had grown closer again over the past year. She'd admitted to spending the weekend with him at the Scottsdale Hotel while I was out of town. She'd admitted that the plan had been for her to come to the apartment that night to provoke a confrontation, that Ryan would claim I'd attacked her without cause, and that they'd use the incident to establish grounds for a lawsuit against me and my insurance. Vanessa had claimed the plan was only about money from a civil suit, but Detective Ortiz said the life insurance policy raised questions about whether there had been more sinister plans discussed. Freeman tried to argue that Vanessa's statement wasn't admissible and that police had coerced a confession, but Judge Delgado said the detective's testimony about his investigation was absolutely relevant to the restraining order hearing. She asked if charges had been filed yet, and Ortiz said the district attorney was reviewing the case for potential conspiracy to commit fraud charges against both Ryan and Vanessa. The courtroom was silent for a long moment. Judge Delgado looked at the evidence spread across her bench and then looked directly at Ryan. Judge Delgado said she'd presided over hundreds of domestic violence cases and had developed a sense for when petitioners were being truthful. In this case, she said, the physical evidence overwhelmingly contradicted Ryan's testimony. The security footage, the phone records, the financial transactions, the witness statements, all of it painted a picture of a planned setup rather than a spontaneous violent incident. She said she was deeply troubled by what appeared to be a false accusation designed to harm an innocent person and profit from that harm. She said such accusations damaged real victims of domestic violence and undermined the legal system's ability to protect people who genuinely needed protection. Judge Delgado denied the restraining order and dismissed it with prejudice, meaning Ryan couldn't refile. She ordered Ryan to pay my attorney fees and court costs. She also stated she was referring the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution of filing a false police report and perjury. Ryan started crying, and Freeman immediately began arguing for reconsideration, but Judge Delgado said her decision was final. I walked out of the courtroom with Victoria feeling like I could breathe for the first time in 2 weeks. Victoria said the case had gone better than she'd hoped, that judges didn't usually dismiss restraining orders this decisively unless the evidence was overwhelmingly one-sided. She said I should prepare for potential criminal charges against Ryan and possible civil litigation if I wanted to pursue damages for what he'd put me through. I drove back to the apartment that afternoon, legally allowed to return now that the restraining order was gone. Ryan's car wasn't in the parking lot, and when I opened the door, I found the place mostly empty. He'd taken his belongings and furniture, leaving behind only the items we'd purchased together. The couch was still there, but the coffee table Vanessa had fallen into was gone. The bedroom had my bed, but none of Ryan's clothes or belongings. The bathroom was stripped of his products. He'd erased himself from the space we'd shared, leaving behind a shell of the life I'd thought we were building. I walked through the rooms feeling disconnected from reality, like I was touring a museum exhibit of my own failed relationship. Olivia came over that evening and helped me clean and reorganize, trying to make the apartment feel like mine instead of ours. She said I should change the locks immediately since Ryan had been giving out key fobs to Vanessa and who knew who else. I called the management office and arranged for a locksmith to come the next morning. That night I slept in my own bed for the first time in 2 weeks, but I couldn't relax. Every sound made me jump. Every car in the parking lot made me check the window, paranoid that Vanessa or Ryan would show up with some new scheme. The fear was irrational but persistent, a reminder that trust, once broken, didn't just heal because a judge dismissed a restraining order. The district attorney's office called me 3 days later. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman named Jennifer Yang who specialized in fraud and conspiracy cases. She asked if I'd be willing to meet and discuss testifying against Ryan and Vanessa if charges were filed. I went to her office downtown and found a woman in her late 30s with sharp intelligence and a direct manner. Jennifer said the DA's office had reviewed all the evidence Detective Ortiz had gathered, plus additional materials Victoria had provided, and they believed they had a strong case for multiple charges. They were planning to charge Ryan with filing a false police report, perjury, and conspiracy to commit fraud. They were charging Vanessa with attempted fraud and conspiracy. Jennifer explained that the conspiracy charge was based on evidence that Ryan and Vanessa had planned the entire incident together with the intent to profit financially through either a civil lawsuit or insurance claim. The potential penalties ranged from probation to several years in prison depending on what could be proven about their ultimate intentions. Jennifer asked me to walk through the timeline again, specifically focusing on any threats or statements Ryan had made about my safety or well-being. I told her I couldn't remember anything explicit, but there had been subtle comments over the past 6 months that felt different in retrospect. Ryan had asked questions about my work insurance and what would happen if I got injured or died. He'd seemed very interested in the details of my life insurance policy, and had even suggested I increase the amount, saying $250,000 wasn't enough for someone with my earning potential. Jennifer took careful notes and said those conversations could be evidence of premeditation if they ever went to trial. She said the DA's office was particularly interested in Vanessa's history of violence and whether there was any evidence she and Ryan had discussed actually harming me, rather than just setting up a fraudulent lawsuit. I told her about Lucas's discovery of Vanessa's assault conviction and her pattern of violent overreaction. Jennifer said they were aware of that history, and it was part of why they were taking the case seriously. She asked if I'd noticed any changes in Ryan's behavior in the weeks before Vanessa showed up, any indication he was preparing for something. I mentioned the weekend he'd sent me to visit Olivia, the increased phone secrecy, the emotional distance that had started about a month before the incident. Jennifer said that timeline matched what they'd found in phone records, that communication between Ryan and Vanessa had intensified significantly around that time, with multiple long calls and hundreds of texts. She said some of those texts had been recovered through Vanessa's phone and were quite damning. She asked if I wanted to see them, and I said yes even though I knew it would hurt. Jennifer pulled up copies on her computer and turned the screen toward me. The texts were from 6 weeks before Vanessa showed up at our apartment. The first text I saw was from Vanessa to Ryan. "You sure you want to go through with this? Once we start, there's no going back." Ryan had responded, "I'm sure. She's not who I thought she was. I need out, and this is the only way that doesn't leave me broke." Vanessa: "And you're okay with the plan? All of it?" Ryan: "Yes. Just make sure it looks convincing. The injury needs to be real enough for medical documentation." Vanessa: "What about after? You really think this gets us enough to start over?" Ryan: "The civil suit alone should be 6 figures, plus her insurance policy if it comes to that." Vanessa: "You mean if something happens to her?" Ryan: "I mean if it becomes necessary. Let's focus on the lawsuit first. That's the goal." The messages continued in that vein for weeks, with Vanessa and Ryan discussing timing, logistics, and how to make sure their story would hold up under scrutiny. They'd talked about gaslighting me to question my own perceptions, about creating witnesses who would support their version, about making sure I seemed unstable or aggressive in the weeks before the incident. Reading the texts felt like watching my life from outside my body, seeing how calculated and cold the betrayal had been. Jennifer let me sit with it for a moment before asking if I was okay. I said I was processing and asked if these texts were enough to prove conspiracy. Jennifer said absolutely. They showed clear premeditation and coordination. With these messages plus the phone records and financial evidence, the case was extremely strong. I asked what would happen to Ryan and Vanessa if they were convicted. Jennifer said the charges carried potential prison time, probably 3 to 5 years for Ryan and 5 to 7 for Vanessa given her prior record. They'd also face financial penalties and restitution orders requiring them to repay my legal fees and any other damages. Jennifer said most defendants in cases this strong tried to plea bargain rather than go to trial, so it was possible Ryan and Vanessa would take deals that involved reduced charges in exchange for guilty pleas. She said she'd keep me informed as the case progressed, and scheduled the formal charging for the following week. I left her office feeling a strange sense of closure beginning to form, like the story was finally resolving into something with defined edges instead of the chaos of the past few weeks. That evening, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously, and Ryan's voice came through sounding broken and desperate. He said he needed to talk to me, that things had gotten out of control and he wanted to explain. I told him he'd been ordered not to contact me and that anything he said could be used against him in the criminal case. Ryan started crying and said he knew he'd messed up, that Vanessa had convinced him the plan would work and no one would get seriously hurt, that it was just supposed to be about getting money for them to start a new life together. I asked if he realized he'd almost destroyed my life, my career, my reputation. Ryan said he was sorry, that he hadn't thought it through, that he'd just been so desperate to get out and Vanessa had made it seem like this was the only way. I asked him why he'd needed to get out when I'd given him no reason to leave, when our relationship had been stable and good. Ryan was quiet for a long moment before saying he'd never really stopped loving Vanessa, that he'd been with me because it was safe and stable, but that he'd been thinking about Vanessa the whole time. He said when Vanessa's marriage fell apart and she'd reached out to him, all the old feelings had come back. He'd wanted to be with her but didn't want to lose the financial security being with me provided. So he and Vanessa had come up with the plan to get money from me through the lawsuit, money they could use to start over together. I asked about the life insurance policy and whether they'd ever discussed actually killing me. Ryan said no, emphatically. That was never part of the plan. But I remembered the text Jennifer had shown me, the one where Vanessa had asked about something happening to me, and Ryan had said, if it becomes necessary. I told Ryan I didn't believe him, that the evidence showed they'd at least considered more permanent solutions. Ryan said I had to believe him, that he'd never have gone that far, that he just wanted money, not to be a murderer. I told him he should save these explanations for his lawyer and hung up. I immediately called Jennifer Yang and reported the contact, and Jennifer said she'd file additional charges for violating court orders not to contact me. She also said Ryan's admission about the scheme was helpful confirmation of what they'd already suspected. The formal charges were filed 1 week later, and both Ryan and Vanessa were arrested. The local news covered the story with headlines like, "Couple accused of elaborate fraud scheme against girlfriend," and "False restraining order leads to criminal charges." I watched the news coverage with Olivia, seeing photos of Ryan and Vanessa being led into court for arraignment. The news reports detailed the phone records, the hotel weekend, the planned confrontation, and the potential life insurance angle. Comments on the news articles were overwhelmingly supportive of me, with people expressing outrage that Ryan and Vanessa had tried to weaponize the legal system against an innocent person. There were also darker comments speculating about what might have happened if their plan had succeeded, whether I'd have ended up seriously injured or worse. Those comments reflected my own thoughts that I tried not to dwell on too much. Both Ryan and Vanessa pleaded not guilty at their arraignment, and trial dates were set for 4 months out. In the meantime, they were released on bail with conditions that included no contact with me and no contact with each other. Jennifer said separating them was strategic, that without being able to coordinate their stories, one of them might crack and take a plea deal that implicated the other. She was right. 6 weeks after the charges were filed, Vanessa's attorney reached out to the DA's office offering a deal. Vanessa would plead guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted extortion in exchange for a reduced sentence. As part of the deal, she'd provide full testimony about the planning and execution of the scheme, including details about discussions regarding my life insurance. Jennifer called me to discuss the plea offer before accepting it. She said Vanessa's testimony would make the case against Ryan airtight, but it would also mean revealing some disturbing details about how far their plans had potentially gone. She wanted to make sure I was prepared for that. I said I wanted the truth, whatever it was, so Jennifer accepted Vanessa's plea and scheduled her formal debriefing for the following week. I was allowed to observe through one-way glass while Jennifer and Detective Ortiz questioned Vanessa. Watching Vanessa sit in that interrogation room, looking smaller and more defeated than I remembered, was surreal. She started by confirming the basic facts we already knew, that she and Ryan had been in secret contact for over a year, that they'd planned the confrontation at my apartment, that the goal had been to set up a civil lawsuit for her injuries. Then Jennifer asked about the life insurance policy and whether that had been part of the plan. Vanessa hesitated and said Ryan had brought it up multiple times, asking what would happen if I had an accident or got hurt more seriously than planned. She said Ryan had become increasingly fixated on the life insurance money, saying $250,000 would be enough for them to disappear and start completely new lives somewhere else. Vanessa said she'd tried to talk him down from those ideas, saying the lawsuit plan was complicated enough without adding murder to the mix. But Ryan had apparently researched ways to make a death look accidental, had looked into how insurance investigations worked, had even talked about staging a break-in gone wrong or a tragic accident. Vanessa said she'd started to get scared of how serious Ryan was becoming about the life insurance plan. She'd tried to back out, but Ryan had threatened to go through with it himself, or frame her for something if she didn't help. That's when she'd decided to go along with the initial confrontation plan, but no further. She said the night she'd shown up at my apartment, she'd been planning to provoke a fight and get injured enough to sue, but she'd gotten more hurt than expected when I'd pushed her into the coffee table. She'd panicked and run, and then Ryan had convinced her to go through with filing the restraining order as they'd planned. But Vanessa said she'd known from that point on that Ryan was dangerous and unstable, and she'd started documenting their conversations in case she needed to protect herself. She'd kept some of the text messages that directly discussed harming me, and she turned those over to Jennifer as part of her plea agreement. Jennifer showed me copies of those messages afterward, and they were chilling. In one exchange from 3 weeks before the incident, Ryan had written, "What if she just disappeared? People have accidents all the time. Construction sites are dangerous." Vanessa had responded, "You're talking crazy. That's not what we agreed." Ryan, "I'm talking about freedom, about not having to split money from a lawsuit when we could have everything. Think about it." The messages showed a progression of Ryan's thinking from fraud to potential violence, and they explained why Vanessa had eventually decided to cooperate with prosecutors. Vanessa's plea deal was finalized, and she was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with credit for time served and good behavior eligibility, after 18 months. In exchange for her cooperation, the more serious charges were dropped. Ryan's trial was scheduled for 2 months after Vanessa's sentencing, and Jennifer said we had an overwhelming case now that Vanessa had provided testimony and evidence. Ryan's attorney, Douglas Freeman, tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Jennifer said the DA's office was insisting on significant prison time given the severity of the conspiracy and the predatory nature of Ryan's planning. Freeman came back with multiple offers, each rejected, until finally Ryan agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false police reports, and attempted extortion. The plea agreement included a 7-year prison sentence with no early release eligibility. Jennifer said it was one of the harshest sentences she'd seen for this type of case, but the judge had been appalled by the evidence of Ryan's escalating plans to potentially harm me. At Ryan's sentencing hearing, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement. Standing in that courtroom and looking at Ryan in his orange jumpsuit, I felt strange detachment from the man I'd thought I'd known. I told the court about how the betrayal had affected every aspect of my life, how I'd questioned my judgment and my ability to trust people, how I'd lost not just a boyfriend but my sense of safety and stability. I said I hoped Ryan would use his time in prison to understand the damage he'd caused and to become someone capable of genuine remorse, rather than just regret at getting caught. Ryan was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, and he said he was sorry for what he'd done, that he'd let fear and desperation drive him to terrible decisions, that he hoped someday I could forgive him. The apology felt empty, scripted by his attorney, but I nodded acknowledgement anyway. Judge Delgado sentenced Ryan to 7 years as agreed in the plea deal and added 5 years of probation after release with strict conditions including no contact with me and mandatory psychological counseling. She said Ryan's actions represented a profound betrayal of trust and an abuse of legal systems meant to protect actual victims. The sentence needed to reflect the seriousness of planning to potentially harm someone for financial gain. I walked out of the courthouse that day feeling like a chapter had finally closed, though the story's effects would linger for years. Olivia was waiting outside, and we drove to a bar and had a drink to mark the end of the legal ordeal. She asked how I was feeling, and I said mostly numb, like my brain hadn't caught up to the fact that it was actually over. She said that was normal, that processing trauma took time, and I should probably consider therapy to work through everything. She was right. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Lisa Tran who specialized in betrayal trauma and relationship abuse. She helped me understand that what Ryan had done wasn't just criminal fraud, but profound psychological abuse, gaslighting me while planning to destroy my life. 6 months after Ryan's sentencing, I sold the apartment and moved to a different part of Phoenix. The space held too many memories, both real and now revealed to be fake, and I needed a fresh start. I bought a small house with a yard and spent weekends renovating it, finding therapy in physical labor and visible progress. Work had been understanding throughout the ordeal, and I'd been promoted to senior project manager as my career continued despite the personal chaos. I started dating again cautiously, taking things slow and being upfront about my trust issues. I met a man named David through a hiking group, and he was patient with my hypervigilance and need for transparency. We took months before becoming serious, and I appreciated his willingness to let me set the pace. 1 year after the restraining order hearing, I was having dinner with David when he asked if I'd ever gotten closure on why Ryan had targeted me specifically. The question caught me off guard because I'd assumed it was just opportunity, that I'd been a convenient mark. David said that level of planning and calculation suggested something more personal, that maybe there'd been a reason Ryan chose me beyond just financial security. The thought stuck with me, and the next day I called Lucas Brennan and asked if he'd ever looked into Ryan's background before he met me. Lucas said he'd done basic checks but hadn't gone deep into his history. I asked him to dig further, to see if there was anything in Ryan's past that might explain his willingness to commit fraud and potentially worse. Lucas called me 2 weeks later with information that recontextualized everything. He'd found that Ryan had been married before, briefly, to a woman named Christine Porter when he was 24. Christine had died in a car accident 11 months into their marriage, and Ryan had been the beneficiary of her life insurance policy, collecting $150,000. At the time, the accident had been ruled just that, an accident. Christine had been driving late at night on a rural road, missed a curve, and crashed into a ravine. But Lucas had pulled the accident report and found some irregularities that hadn't been fully investigated. Christine's brake lines had been damaged, which the original investigator attributed to impact damage. But a closer look at the photos showed the damage pattern was more consistent with deliberate cutting than accident trauma. There'd been questions but no evidence and no follow-up investigation because Ryan had been out of state at a work conference when the accident happened. He'd had an alibi, but Lucas had traced his movements and found he'd flown back to town the day before the accident, stayed at a hotel near Christine's work, and flown out again the morning after. The trip hadn't been documented anywhere because he'd paid cash for the hotel and used a friend's credit card for the flights. Lucas said it was entirely possible Ryan had killed his first wife for life insurance money and had been planning to do the same to me with Vanessa's help. The evidence was circumstantial, but disturbing. I took Lucas's findings to Jennifer Yang, and she reviewed everything carefully before saying this opened up potential new investigations, but wasn't strong enough to pursue charges related to Christine's death after so many years. What it did do was provide context for Ryan's sentencing and parole hearings, establishing a potential pattern of using relationships to exploit insurance policies. Jennifer said she'd make sure the information was added to Ryan's file and that parole boards would be aware of his possible history when considering early release. I asked if Christine's family had ever been told about the suspicions regarding her death, and Jennifer said not at the time because there'd been no evidence. But now, with Ryan's conviction and the patterns Lucas had uncovered, it might be worth reaching out to them. I spent a long time thinking about whether to contact Christine's family, ultimately deciding they deserved to know that questions existed about her death, even if they couldn't be definitively answered. I reached out through a lawyer to Christine's sister, who agreed to meet with me and Lucas. Sitting across from Christine's sister Lauren in a coffee shop and explaining our suspicions was one of the hardest conversations I'd ever had. Lauren listened without interrupting, her face growing paler as we laid out the timeline and evidence. When we finished, she said she'd always felt something was wrong about the accident, that Christine had been an excellent driver and the curve where she'd crashed wasn't particularly dangerous. But the police had been satisfied with their ruling, and Lauren hadn't known how to push for more investigation. Learning that Ryan had potentially killed Christine for money validated her instincts but also opened a wound that had been healing for years. Lauren asked what she could do now, and Lucas explained that reopening a case this old would require significant new evidence. What we had was suggestive but not conclusive. Lauren said she didn't care about prosecution as much as she cared about the truth being known, about Christine's memory not being tainted by the idea that she'd just made a driving mistake. Lucas offered to compile a full report of his findings that Lauren could use to request an official cold case review if she wanted. Lauren agreed, and we left that meeting with a shared understanding that some questions might never be fully answered, but asking them mattered anyway. 2 years after the initial restraining order was filed, I was in a good place. The therapy had helped me process the betrayal and rebuild trust in my own judgment. My relationship with David had grown into something stable and honest, built on transparency rather than secrets. Work was fulfilling, my house renovations were complete, and I'd reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the time with Ryan. Olivia and I were closer than ever, bonded by the experience of navigating crisis together. Life had returned to something resembling normal, though I carried awareness that normalcy was fragile and trust had to be earned continuously. I'd learned to pay attention to red flags and to trust my instincts when something felt off. The story of what happened with Ryan and Vanessa became something I shared carefully, only with people who needed to understand why I approached relationships the way I did. Most people were shocked by the calculated nature of the betrayal, by how long Ryan had maintained the facade while planning destruction. 3 years after everything happened, I married David in a small ceremony with close friends and family. Olivia was my maid of honor, and her toast referenced the journey we'd been through together without dwelling on the dark details. She said something about how I'd faced the worst kind of betrayal and come through it with my integrity intact, that she was proud to call me her sister. David's vows talked about building trust through actions, not words, about choosing each other every day with clear eyes and open hearts. Mine talked about second chances and finding light after darkness, about gratitude for people who proved that not everyone was hiding knives behind their smiles. We meant every word. The life we built together was deliberately different from what I'd had with Ryan. We kept separate finances, we were transparent about phone calls and emails, we checked in constantly about how we were feeling and what we needed. Some people might have called it hypervigilance, but we called it healthy boundaries. 4 years after the restraining order hearing, I got a notification that Ryan was up for a parole hearing. He'd served just over half his sentence and was petitioning for early release based on good behavior and completed rehabilitation programs. Jennifer Yang reached out to ask if I wanted to submit a victim impact statement opposing parole. I thought about it for days before deciding to write a statement, not out of vengeance but out of practical concern that Ryan hadn't served enough time to genuinely change his patterns. My statement detailed the psychological impact of his actions, the financial costs, the damage to my ability to trust, and my belief that 7 years wasn't excessive for someone who'd planned to potentially kill me for insurance money. Thanks for watching till the end.